So we're going to continue our study then of the early history of the Missouri Synod in North Dakota. And as I mentioned yesterday, specifically more of the history of the Minnesota Dakota district in North Dakota, because that's mostly what we're talking about in this time period. We left off yesterday talking about the very first years and the very earliest movements of the first pastors in the state. We talked about men like Krieger and Winkler and Frick and those guys, okay? But from this point going forward, I'm actually going to have to shift gears a little bit because it was easy enough to talk about these guys when there was only like 2, 3 of them. But it's pretty soon going to magnify into lots of different guys, and so I can't talk about absolutely everything. As I mentioned yesterday, I've identified more than 100 pastors in 200 places within the state, even within this 40-year period. So obviously I have to pick and choose. And Lord willing, and maybe this is an answer to your question, Bradmeyer, Lord willing, I eventually do want to produce a work that will talk about this period in its entirety so that you'll be able to get the whole picture rather than just kind of this overview like I have right now. But today is not that day. So we're going to be focusing on some of the more broader movements across the state so that we can finally get down to the stopping point of 1910 when the district finally divides. Now, again, as we saw yesterday, there's a general pattern at work. The Rev would come into the state, and they'd go over this enormous area, sometimes talking hundreds of miles, in order to cover and to gain new ground. And then after a couple of years, their enormous field would divide up, new pastors would be called, they would be installed into a smaller area, but they often, in turn, became Rev themselves, and the cycle begins again. So you kind of get this continuous expansion, division, and that's kind of the pattern that we see at the early part of this period. Now, so far, up to this point, we've really only limited ourselves to one part of North Dakota, and that is, of course, the Red River Valley. There's good reasons for that, of course, that's where most people were. I mean, most people lived in the Red River Valley at the time, so it makes sense that they'd focus their attention there. People didn't really settle westward very much yet, mostly because it was very difficult to go west. I mean, the prairies are not very conducive to travel. Besides the fact that, if you were on horse, for example, you'd be limited by water, which in many cases would be very limited. And of course, there's no trees, so you don't have any fuel for fire. So westward progression started off pretty slowly. But that's about to change now with the coming of the railroads. So North Dakota is crossed by 3 major rail lines: the Northern Pacific, the Great Northern, and the Sioux Line. The Northern Pacific is the oldest of these 3 lines. It's the one going west from Fargo. So think of the rail that goes from Fargo towards Bismarck and eventually continuing on to Montana. That is the Northern Pacific. The Northern Pacific first reached Moorhead in 1871, and the bridge was built across the Red River in 1872, and the tracks were laid all the way to Bismarck by the summer of 1873, at which point it stopped for a while. Of course, Bismarck was also named Edwinton at the time. It only became Bismarck later. After completing that line, as far as Bismarck, the company was granted a number of land grants. Basically, they were given a whole bunch of North Dakota land, the idea being that they could then turn around and sell that land as a way of financing their work. Which means that with the completion of this rail line, the settlers start to pour in westward into North Dakota. And we start seeing them increasing in numbers and picking up speed over time. The Northern Pacific, unfortunately, was plagued by a number of financial problems, so they weren't able to continue their work right away. But they resumed in 1876, building west of the Missouri River, but they didn't actually build the bridge right away. And so, of course, the Missouri River would continue to be a problem. So how they dealt with it? They ferried the train across the river, which I think is just remarkable. To load, I mean, these trains obviously were much smaller back then, and obviously a lot lighter. But yeah, they would just load the train up onto the ferry, move across the river, take it off again. And that's what they did for a number of years. But on October 21st, 1882, the bridge at Bismarck was finally completed, which made westward travel much, much easier. The second of the great rail lines was the Great Northern. That's the High Line going west of Grand Forks through Williston. That line was starting to be built in 1879, and it was completed over the next couple of years. And that allowed the northern part of the state to start being settled as well. The Sioux Line is the last of the three great railroads through North Dakota, and it runs diagonally from Hankinson to Portal. So it's the one that kind of goes up like this through the state. Okay? That where it continues into Canada because it's a major line for traffic into Canada as well. That one was entered the state in 1891. It reached Portal by 1893, and it brought along a lot of settlers with it. And of course, it's not an exaggeration to say that North Dakota would not be possible apart from the railroad, because the location of many of our towns, the location of many of the people that live in the state is because of the demands of the railroad. I mean, just look along the interstate, right? Why are towns every 20 miles? It's because of the railroad. So,
you know why?
what's that?
Water. Why?
Because of water. Because they're steam trains. So, and our district also owes the railroad a great deal. As German settlers began to pour in, Missouri began to look westward. So let's turn our attention then to some of the Reiseprediger who began to focus to the west. A man that we met yesterday will be the first one, Pt.2 Hink. So after returning to the seminary in Springfield in the year 1880, Pt.2 completed his studies and passed his exams, and he was sent to Millbank, South Dakota, where Frederick Pfotenhauer ordained him August 13th, 1882. It's worth noting that that particular year makes him a contemporary of Engel, who was up in the northern part of North Dakota, as well as Frick and Kaler down here in Richland County. So they're kind of all in the same time period. Pt.2, however, even though he was ordained and installed in South Dakota, was not content to sit still. His experiences as a vicar made him kind of restless. He was ready to get going westward to find whoever he could find. And so he began to work all along the northern border of South Dakota. Pfotenhauer had already done some work along this way, but Pt.2 took it further, especially in the James River Valley, traveling very long distances over this area. Now, I will admit that I don't have a complete picture of everything that Pt.2 did in South Dakota just yet, but I can at least give you some official numbers that were recorded for him in the statistics. So by 1882, Pt.2 is already, so this is within months of his ordination, Pt.2 is already listed as having 2 congregations and 12 stations. So, I mean, he's not sitting still. And again, these are spread all over this entire area. So within 4 months, he's serving an area more than 100 miles long. But because it was so long, and the demands of this area, he didn't actually stay in Millbank for very long. Shortly after his ordination, he requested and received a release from his congregation, which they gave him. So Millbank went back to Pfotenhauer. So again, he was only there for maybe a couple of months at most. So now, with his face fixed to the west, he took up residence near Groton, South Dakota. And from Groton, his field extended all the way to the Missouri River. So in other words, again, at least 100 miles. I mean, how many of you guys know where Groton is? Your son was there? Yeah. Well, there you go.
Who hunts pheasants in Groton?
What's that?
Who hunts pheasants in Groton?
Well, there you go.
Yeah, pheasant hunter.
He could be a pheasant hunter. He probably didn't have time to hunt pheasants, though. Already at the second convention of the Minnesota Dakota District, May 31st to June 6th, 1883, in Cortland, Minnesota, Pt.2 gave a report of his work. He was talking about how he was roaming all over the James River Valley, assisted by his own vicar, a man named Michael Lamer, who was later ordained as a prediger in Texas. Together, these two served the large number of settlers who were starting to pour into the area. But Pt.2 remarked that unfortunately he was not able to get to every place that he would have liked to get. He was constrained by time. Imagine that. But if the Lord willed it, he says, that he would get to them soon as well. However, Pt.2's focus was not limited just to South Dakota. He also turned his attention to the north, so that sometime in the year 1883, he made the initial contact with families near Ellendale in the Albion Township. There you go, Paul. The Mother Church. Albion's own history books record what happened on that day. And this is what it says. The first time that he drove over the prairie toward the settlement east of the Albion Church, he met two Heine boys. Did I say that right? Sons of Mr. and Mrs. Carl Heine, Sr. They had recently come by covered wagon from Nebraska. The pastor asked the boys, "Wohnen hier deutsche Leute?" Are there any German people living here? The boys answered with another question. "Wollt ihr auch Land kaufen?" Do you also wish to buy land? After a short conversation, the boys directed him to their home. Here, Pastor Hink met the only daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Heine, Rosalie, who later became his wife. So sometimes pastors' wives came from the prairies, too. Following the initial contact, then, Hink began to serve Albion regularly, even though it would not be organized during his time. And as Paul pointed out, Albion would later become Christ Lutheran, the mother church of many churches in that area of the state. And Christ Lutheran Albion would later merge into Zion Ellendale, which was one of its daughter congregations in 1975. So it's one of those congregations that's no longer in existence. Now, I can't help myself, but I have to share a delightful little story here. This is Pt.2 Hink and his wife, Rosalie. And this is a story about that same day when they first met. And this is written by their daughter, Alma, who was writing about it afterwards as a kind of memoir. This is what she says. "I have always liked the story that Mama's brothers were telling. It seems as if she and grandmother were working with geese on this particular day. Here comes this young man with his buck wagon and ponies. Everyone was glad just to see someone, anyone, to help relieve the monotony and homesickness for Germany and the many relatives and friends left behind in their beloved homeland. In the excitement of seeing this handsome young stranger, according to Mama's ever-loving brothers, she strangled the goose she was handling. Mama indignantly denied this story forever after. However, her brothers had lots of fun trying to make this story stick. I guess he was a handsome young man. Pt.2 would later move into the Ellendale area where he would continue to plant churches until he finally accepted and received and accepted a call to serve Trinity Great Bend, where he was installed February 21st, 1886, a call that he would serve the rest of his life until he died in 1930. He is buried there in their cemetery, just south of town. I actually visited that grave, so if you get a chance, go over there and meet him. Okay. Any questions about Pt.2 then, before I move on to our next little section?
Rosalie's also with me.
Yeah, Rosalie's there, and also two of their children are buried there too. So,
And more geese.
was that?
And more geese.
And more geese, yes.
No geese, they're ponies.
All right. Teacha is thus the first example of this westward movement into the state, or at least western movement in the area. However, for the next man, we need to go back to 1882 in order to meet the young man who had just come fresh out of seminary, Reverend Herman Glace. And you'll notice the very casual attitude that he has in the picture there. That was honestly the seminary picture. That's the official picture. I don't know what they were doing back then.
Why isn't he wearing a collar? Okay.
Yeah, exactly. Herman Glace was born August 15th, 1859, and he studied at St. Louis. After passing his exam, he was sent to Minnesota, where he was ordained in Perham, July 31st, 1881, by Hertwig. There you go, Clark. There's Hertwig again. So,
Yep.
I want to talk about Hertwig, but I have to pass him by. So,
Understandable. Minnesota's a different country anyway.
yeah, foreign territory. But this also means that he's a contemporary of like Engel and Kaler and Krieger, and he's just before Kaler would be ordained. So just kind of give you a sense of where we are in the timeline. One thing to note about Glace, however, is that he appears to have been a very sickly man, something of a frail constitution. And because of that, he would later permanently resign from the ministry in Iowa in 1889, at which point he then moved on and did other things for the rest of his life. But despite his poor health, he continued to travel very widely for the sake of the kingdom of God. And at the same second convention of the Minnesota Dakota district that I mentioned, he gave a report of his extensive field. And it said that he was basically serving all along the Northern Pacific Railroad from Brainerd, Minnesota to Jamestown, despite his health. So, and as far as I can tell, what he would do is that he would get on the train, he'd go to the next stop, get off, see if there was anybody that could be found. If there was, he would start a station there. If there wasn't, he would move on to the next one and so forth. And that's just what he did. He was just constantly looking to establish these stations all along the rail to Jamestown. I don't know what became of these stations yet. I don't even know what became of his work in Jamestown. It could be that it was just a temporary thing. But at least for the statistical report for 1883, it says that he was serving 4 congregations and 12 stations. And he is also one that there is some evidence that he had done work in the Fargo-Moorhead area, just like Krieger had done before him. So, Glace, however, should be remembered for another very important trip that he made, one that would have enormous consequences for the history, not only of North Dakota, but also of the Missouri Synod in general. And to explain this, we first have to meet a different young man who was serving in Minnesota around the same time. Reverend Adolf Pfotenhauer, the younger brother of Friedrich Pfotenhauer, born July 28, 1860. He graduated from St. Louis, was ordained in Morris County, Minnesota, October 15, 1882, by Fetter, which means that he's coming into the field about 2 months after Hink. And they're not classmates because Hink went to Springfield and Pfotenhauer went to St. Louis, but we're not going to start that debate. So, Adolf also gave a report at the 1883 convention and of an important contact which he made during that time. And I want to read at least some of that report, especially because it gives another good picture of the kind of challenges that Reiseprediger faced in those days. So this is the beginning of that report. After a splendid conference with Pastor Fetter, my brother graciously offered to accompany me, and I set out to explore the whole area north of me. Admittedly, the weather dealt us one blow after the other, because downpours and storms were our constant companions. But we dare not put off this trip, otherwise danger threatened. The Methodists would beat us there and twist people's heads. Indeed, for a traveling preacher, the weather plays no role at all. What does a traveling preacher ask about the weather? Our trip was a great blessing. We found 4 settlements consisting of 12, 10, 6, and 4 families. Our hunch that the Methodists might already have gotten in everywhere unfortunately proved true. We naturally inquired first, before anything else, whether the people had received this Methodist preacher as their preacher and curate, for if that was the case, we had no more right to them. But thank God, nowhere did this preacher appear as requested. He had always come without an invitation, thus without a call. We were received everywhere with joy, and through tears it was lamented that up to now a Lutheran preacher had not come. With joy they drew out of the pure fountain of Israel and listened eagerly to every word which we said to them. So as Pfotenhauer shows then in the first part of his report, Reiseprediger had to contend with many things, not the least of which was, well, the weather. There were many other reports from this time period of men who nearly froze to death because they were traveling through winter, and they talk about being caught in like wet conditions or just being caught even in blizzard-like conditions, and only by the grace of God were they able to pull through. And of course, there's also plenty of examples of Reiseprediger who would get completely soaking wet, and of course, that's always a danger in any time. But like Adolf says, what is the weather to a Reiseprediger? The word must go out. And of course, there was also the challenges of different preachers. They were effectively racing in some cases to reach the new settlers so that they could bring them the pure gospel. There was a sense of urgency in their work. But let me continue to the critical part of his report. In one place, we met a woman from Montana who was visiting her sister who lived here. She was a marvelous, dear soul. She had just recovered from having a small child, which we baptized. Urgently, she asked us whether or not even one Lutheran pastor could come to Montana. There were very many Lutherans there who were like scattered sheep, having no shepherd. We promised her to present the matter to the Missions Commission. Now, Adolf doesn't say much about her in this particular report, but later on, in other reports, we learned that this woman was from Miles City. But no one seems to know what her name actually was. That just got lost to history. But regardless, like the Macedonian man who called Paul to come over to help them, she was calling Missouri to go west and to serve the Germans who were settling in the rapidly expanding cattle and mining towns of territorial Montana. The mission board assigned Reverend Glace to this task, despite his health. I imagine the reason for that was because, well, he was already working on the railroad, he was close to it, seemed to be a kind of a natural choice. And so on March 17th, 1884, Glace boarded the train to travel the 947 miles one way to Helena, Montana, making several stops along the way. So Herman Glace then is the father of the Missouri Synod in Montana. And his work in the far west would basically focus around Helena. His health wouldn't permit him to go to do anything more. But after a quick turnaround then, Glace returned to Montana in June of the same year. And let me read to you a little bit of an article talking about that second trip. This is what it says. His condition at its outset was described as made under great bodily illness, and his arrival in Helena found him sick and weary. Yet he arranged for the use of a public hall for German Lutheran services the next Sunday morning, and he undertook to visit and to invite all the known German Lutherans to the service. On Saturday afternoon, he was informed that the hall would not be available on Sunday morning, but rather on Sunday evening. So once again, he started on his round of information and invitation. Only 4 men and 12 women attended that Sunday evening service in June. 2 children were baptized at the service. Later, the preacher learned, to the further aggravation of his illness and tiredness that a community dance that June Sunday evening had kept so many of the German Lutherans from taking advantage of the rare opportunity to attend a Christian and Lutheran worship.
Nothing new under the sun.
And I wanted to include that quote exactly for that reason. Because I think sometimes we get this notion that, well, the Reiseprediger, all they had to do was just show up and a church would just spring out of the ground, that's all they needed to do. That people don't care about God now, that's why we struggle and why they had it so easy. Well, Glaze shows that that's simply not the case.
So instead of dances, we have sports.
We have sports, yeah, or, anything that keeps people away from God. Worldliness and disinterest in God's word is not limited to our own time. Not every place that Reiseprediger went to was receptive to the word of God. They struggled just as much as we do. But despite the challenges, and for Glaze that included his health, he still went out. He was calling all to repentance. And the fact that we still have congregations at all in Montana shows that God's word does not return void, even despite the challenges.
So
Mhm.
I have to ask, he looks like our first African-American preacher.
No, he's very much white. He's very much white.
But in that picture, he kind of does.
Yeah, I could see it.
I think it's the hat. And there's several Germans that, they even call there are Negro Germans.
Right.
Sure.
Black
Oh, yeah.
Every picture I've seen of him is just like this. He looks pretty white. So Glaze took a call to Iowa shortly after his return from his June trip. His health was basically too far broken to continue in the Dakotas and in Minnesota. But the mission board did not want to give up on Montana. So Friedrich Pfotenhauer was sent the following year. So he left Minnesota on April 8th, 1885. And because he was in much more robust health than Glaze had been, he was able to get to far more of western Montana. Pfotenhauer visited virtually all of the major cities out west. And after that trip, that first trip of his, they finally called a candidate to serve Montana. Yes, Montana. That was his goal. But he would not arrive until the following year. And so Pfotenhauer made a second trip, leaving in the first part of March 1886. And basically what he was doing was he was kind of reassuring the congregations that had been established out west that we haven't forgotten about you, somebody is coming, trust in God, that sort of thing. So he continued that trip and he returned towards the end of the month. But an important point for North Dakota history happens at this point. On his return trip home, as he's coming back eastward towards Minnesota, passing through the state, he made a stop, a fateful stop, in New Salem. And despite being tired from his long journey, Pfotenhauer made his inquiries as he usually did. And he learned that there was a group of Lutherans living to the north. And so he made the trip north with 2 men by pony. And to quote the article that talks about that stop, after the company had reached the settlement, the news was quickly spread that the pastor would conduct services on the following morning. In a small hut filled to capacity, the missionary delivered the first sermon in this settlement. Until this time, reading services had been conducted every Sunday morning. Dr. Pfotenhauer made other trips to this settlement, but the first visit is best remembered. So on March 29th, 1886, Pfotenhauer began the work in Hanover, which would be the later St. Peter. And I'm not just saying that because, it's this church I serve. This isn't just a self-serving thing. Hanover would become the mother church of many of the churches and places in western and in central North Dakota. But I will explain how that will happen as we go forward. question. Yes.
The reading service, was that typical?
Yes.
Is that kind of an anomaly that the community was in the habit of gathering together on a Sunday morning?
It's hard to say, like if they found it, kind of one that was already there doing these things. Sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't. But once a congregation is organized, reading services became the norm. So even if the pastor can't be there for 6 months, they are still meeting every single week. But what they would, and maybe I'll just explain the reading service just to make sure it's clear, they would still gather together and they would have a book of sermons that one of the men of the congregation would then read to the congregation. So they're still gathered around God's word. They just don't have a pastor to serve them all the time. Yeah.
What types of sermons would those be? Would those be like Luther sermons or?
Luther was common. There was also New Salem actually has their old sermon book still. Scriver is his name. He's from the 17th century. I'd have to look again. But anyway, well-known preachers from Germany, like Luther or other, from later ones, that they would bring the book over with them, and that's what they would read. Yes.
I have it. If you ever want to look, I see it. W. Walter's Pushville.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, they probably wouldn't have had that one yet. Maybe they did, but no, that's a great resource too. Absolutely.
Do you know if they're arranged by the liturgical year, or do they just pick out a sermon and read it?
Depended on the book and the place. I mean, you're asking me questions about something that I know that they recorded very little about, right? Just because they were doing it, they had the book, but it's not like they were writing anything down. So let us move out of western central North Dakota and go back to the northeast part of the state in Pembina County, where we meet Julius Frick, who we met yesterday. He continued to serve in this area, but again, as following the familiar pattern, his large field soon divided. And so to take over the churches in the north in Pembina County, a man by the name of Martin Fueling was called. Born May 31st, 1862, Fueling studied at St. Louis and was ordained in St. Thomas August 22nd, 1886 by Frick. This would mean that it's the same year that Hink was installed in Great Bend, just to kind of, again, make some connections there. But Frick, at the same time, had already received and accepted a call to serve Arlington, Minnesota. And so a successor was called to Hillsboro at the same time. And that is a man by the name of Edward Strulin. But I unfortunately do not yet have a picture for him, so I'll at least just put his name up here so you can see what it is. Strulin was born May 9th, 1856, and he was ordained in Defiance, Kansas, August 17th, 1884. Meaning that Strulin was the very first pastor to be installed in North Dakota, one who had been ordained somewhere else and actually installed in the state. Incidentally, the man who ordained him was a man by the name of Jonas Matthias. We're not going to meet him for a while, but Jonas is eventually going to end up in North Dakota, so we'll talk about him a little bit later. Anyway, Strulin was installed in Hillsboro October 31st, 1886 by Frick. Frick then left. And while Fueling and Strulin did not go nearly as far west as Glace or Pfotenhauer did, together they began to push further west in the northern part of North Dakota. So there was a group of families near Niagara who originally sent a letter to Frick asking him to come and to serve them. But by the time that their letter arrived to Frick in the fall of 1886, he was already gone. So Strulin, therefore, took up the call, and he went out to Niagara around the time of December 1886. And the Niagara history suggests that he was there for around Christmas time, that he preached a Christmas sermon. And Lord knows what the weather was like. But while in the area, Strulin also sought out some other stations that he could serve. This is why we see the beginning of a station called Grand Harbor, which was the original location of what would later be called St. Peter in Devil's Lake. The long distances between Hillsborough and the Devil's Lake area meant that Zelwyn could not come very often. And his next known visit to this area was May of the following year, 5 months later. He did have a vicar named Frederick Schilke, who was later a pastor in South Dakota, to assist him, but he didn't come very often either. So because of those long distances, Fueling also made excursions into the area. And he went out in 1887 to serve these new stations in Niagara and the Devil's Lake area. And I should also mention at this point that sharing stations like this was also pretty common. If it was a distant one or if it was especially difficult to get to, a number of pastors would basically take turns getting out there whenever they could. They're not organized yet. They haven't issued an official call, so it's more of just we need to help these people as often as we can get there. Fueling, however, did not limit himself to these two places. Closer to home, he began work in Dresden, the later Emmanuel, and he also had a short-lived station in Grafton. But that station does not appear to have continued beyond him. But critically for the history of the district, Fueling also made an excursion much further west, where he had a short-lived station at Rugby, but he also made the initial contact with Willow Creek. Willow Creek's history says that Fueling took the train to Rugby, he took a coach to Willow City, and then he walked to Willow Creek. 6 miles.
No, it's a little bit further than
Is it further? Okay, you can correct me on that. How far is it?
7.5.
Quick question.
Yeah.
The Grafton one, do you have the name of the church?
No, it never lasted beyond Fueling.
Because I've heard stories about a Concordia Lutheran just west of Grafton.
Well, if you have information, I'll take it.
No, that's all I know.
Okay. That's more than I know. So,
Yeah. Because there's a cemetery out there still.
well, like I said, this one, what happened was that he started it when he left, it kind of died, and then new work began in Grafton later.
Right.
So that's
But Acton Township was the first church, and then they split in the 1940s.
So we see here the beginning of Emmanuel Willow Creek. Fueling didn't come very often. Unfortunately, like others, his health was not very great. He took a call to Chicago, Illinois in 1888. Zelwyn also came a couple of times before he also left for Minnesota in 1888. But unlike the short-lived stations in Rugby and in Grafton, Emmanuel Willow Creek, of course, would remain, as it still is here today. And it would become the central hub for mission in that part of the state, especially due to the work of two brothers, the first of whom and the elder of whom we're now going to meet. Gotthard Potratz is a name that we would do well to remember, because he is one of the giants in our history. Born January 10th, 1851, Potratz studied at Springfield. And after passing his examination, he was sent to North Dakota, where he was ordained as Zelwyn's successor at Hillsborough, September 23rd, 1888. The man who ordained him was a man by the name of Herman Brower, Fueling's successor up north, but we are going to pass him by. Gotthard was a man of boundless energy. He traveled all over, including large parts of Minnesota. And I think it's worthwhile to include a few stories about him and his work. We see something of the drive and the determination which Gotthard had in the words which he kept ever before him. Because it is said that he had written over his study desk the words of Jeremiah 48:10. Verflucht sei der des Herrn Werk lässig tut. Cursed is he who does the work of the Lord with slackness. He never wanted to be accused of being lazy, especially when souls were on the line. And reflecting on his own experiences, Gotthard would later write, "Yes, when I think on the mission trips of previous times, where I, apart from the service of present places, every 4 or 5 weeks, I would spend 9 consecutive days away from home in the northwestern fields, and on returning home would be regarded as a stranger to the smallest of my children, for they had forgotten me. Or when I, far from here, lost my way in a snowstorm at night, laid myself down behind a haystack, and wrapped my preaching gown around my head. I did not want to sleep. It could have easily become a longer sleep. Ever colder it crept up from below. It took extraordinary effort to bring the already stiffened feet into motion, to fight off sleep, and to march out again without a plan into the gloomy night. But I was saved 2 hours later in a chicken coop. Then I seemed to myself to be lazy and sluggish now, and my life in the office seems very comfortable to me. And in this comfort will you then let me remain concerning the division of my field, so long as it pleases God." He looked at himself as now being lazy in comparison, simply because his field had been so divided that he had less to do. I think that says something about the kind of man that he was. But it was hardly the only time that his life would be in danger in the course of his duties. Another of his co-workers, although I don't know exactly who, the source doesn't tell me, would write this about him. He was a diligent laborer in the Lord's vineyard. Neither a snowstorm nor rain, neither cold nor heat, could prevent him from conducting an announced service in the most distant places. If the railroad failed him, then he traveled on foot along the rails 20 to 30 miles until he reached his destination, sometimes barefooted when the shoes pinched, or to save them. If the roads were impassable in spring, or in winter the snow too deep, then this former dragoon went up into the saddle. Of his many narrow escapes from death, we would cite but one. Coming home at night in a sled from a filial congregation lost in a snowstorm, he unhitched the weary horses, set them free in order that they might save themselves, if possible. Then he seated himself behind his upturned sled and fell asleep, according to human reckoning, a victim of death by freezing. But something continually tugged the sleeve of his fur coat until he fully awoke. It was his old faithful pony. But the usually supple man was frozen so stiff that he was unable to mount his pony. Yet he could grab the halter rope to let himself be dragged for about a mile up to his home barn. God had saved his traveling missionary. It is indeed a testament to God's mercy that he kept Gotthard safe through so many dangers. And Pfotenhauer himself would later write that despite all of the dangers that the Reiseprediger faced, not one was ever lost in the carrying out his work. God had kept them all safe through many dangers and blessed their work time and time again. So serving out of Hillsborough then, Gotthard took over the whole field which Struhling and Fueling had begun, serving Grand Harbor, Niagara, and Willow Creek as often as he could. He would also start work in Hope, the later Trinity, Michigan, the later Zion, Thompson, later called St. Matthew, although we'll talk about that later. And important for later on, he also would organize the congregation in Sabin, Minnesota, the later Trinity. Now, I know that there are places I have missed. I mean, some sources suggest that he had as many as 24 stations. But even just these are a testament to his dedication and to his zeal. A zeal that we will see was also shared by his younger brother. But we won't talk about him until the next session.